She wasn't wearing shoes. She wasn't wearing dignity either. On the day Clara Mae Whitmore was put up for auction, not a single hand in the crowd was raised. Her father had died owing war debts, and the only thing left to settle them was her no family, no future, no choice. But then, from the edge of the dust and judgment, a silent cowboy stepped forward, not to buy her, but to save what little she still had: her name, her soul, her right to be more than a debt paid in flesh. If you had lost everything and someone offered you nothing but a quiet place and their word, would you dare to trust it? Would you stay and build something no one could take away again? This is the story of survival, not just from danger, but from shame, silence, and the long echo of war. And maybe, just maybe, it's a love story, too. If this touched you, share your thoughts in the comments and support the channel by subscribing. Your voice helps these forgotten stories live on. Now, settle in, because what happened next changed two lives forever. She stood there, bare-shouldered, heart pounding, while not a single soul in that dusty crowd offered a dime. The sun bore down on the square like a judge, and the heat clung to Clara Mae Whitmore's skin like shame. Her dress, or what was left of it, had been torn to the waist, sleeves ripped clean from the seams. She tried to pull the fabric closer to her chest, but her hands had been tied with a thin rope. Even that felt excessive, considering how little fight she had left. Children watched from behind their mothers' skirts. Men leaned against cracked storefronts, chewing tobacco and whispering low, crude things. Someone chuckled when the auctioneer shouted for a second time. $200, anyone this girl's healthy, educated, comes from good stock. Clara clenched her jaw. Educated. That word tasted like ash now. Once, she had stood before blackboards, chalk dust on her fingers, teaching little ones their letters in a classroom her father helped build. But that was before he died of fever, before his debts surfaced like bloated corpses, before the town decided his daughter was the only thing of value left to seize. A gust of dry wind blew across the square, kicking up grit that stung her cheeks and eyes. She didn't cry. Not because she wasn't scared, God knew she was, but because crying meant the crowd had taken something from her she wasn't ready to give. Not yet. The auctioneer's voice cracked. 150. Come on. Now, you ain't gonna find better shoulders or finer manners. She can read Latin, for heaven's sake. A few people laughed. Someone in the crowd spat. She saw faces she used to greet in church, people her father had prayed with, women who once brought her peach preserves. Now they looked at her like spoiled fruit, useless, too ripe, bound for rot. A bead of sweat slipped down her spine. She stared at the horizon, past the general store, past the livery stable, toward the hills that bled into sky. If she squinted, she could almost pretend she was elsewhere, anywhere but here. Then, movement. From the shade beneath an old cottonwood tree, a man stepped forward. He wasn't part of the crowd, not really. Hadn't joined in the laughter, hadn't shouted, hadn't moved at all until now. He walked slow, deliberate, boots thudding against the packed earth like a metronome. Dust curled up behind his steps. He wore a dark hat, pulled low, coat faded from sun and time. A graying beard shadowed his jaw, and his frame, though lean, carried weight not from muscle, but from grief, or memory, or both. Clara didn't know his name, but she'd seen him before. Twice, maybe 3 times in town. Folks called him Boone, Elijah Boone. Lived out past Big Elm Creek, in the hills, alone. He didn't speak as he approached. Just reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a leather pouch, and handed it to the auctioneer. The man opened it, counted silently. $300. Gasps spread through the crowd like wildfire. $300. The auctioneer repeated, voice unsteady now. "Well, I suppose that'll do, unless someone else wants no." It was the first time Boone spoke. One word, flat, final. The auctioneer nodded, more out of unease than agreement. He untied Clara's hands. They fell to her sides, raw from the rope. She didn't move. Boone stepped beside her but didn't touch her. He simply looked at the crowd, eyes cold, unmoved, and then at her. "You can walk," he said quietly. His voice was deeper than she expected. Steady. Not kind, exactly, but not cruel either. She took a step, then another. The crowd parted as they passed. No one met her eyes. No one dared. She followed him across the square, past the courthouse, past the old well. The sound of boots and whispers trailed behind them. A man from the saloon muttered, "Crazy old bastard," someone else replied. "Ain't no woman worth that kind of coin." Boone didn't turn. He didn't break stride. When they reached his horse, an aging sorrel with a steady gaze, he helped her into the saddle. She winced, her ribs aching from the days spent in the jailhouse. He mounted behind her but kept distance, reins loose in one hand. Before they rode off, he looked back at the town once. They stared. He stared back. Then, finally, in a voice low but firm, he said it. "I'm not buying a woman." A pause. "I'm saving a soul." And with that, he nudged the horse forward. They rode into the dust, leaving behind the stares, the heat, the shame. But Clara knew. That moment, that man had changed everything. What kind of man spends his last dollar to save a stranger? And what kind of woman dares to believe she's worth saving? He hadn't spoken more than 10 words to a soul in town for years. Why her? The sun dipped lower as they rode, casting long shadows over the plains. The trail out of Sweetwater Hollow was narrow, framed by brittle sagebrush and bone-dry earth. Clara sat stiffly in the saddle, every jolt of the horse sending a tremor through her sore muscles. Elijah Boone rode behind, silent as the land itself. He didn't ask questions, didn't offer his name, didn't look at her unless necessary, and yet he had bought her, with real money, in front of everyone. As they passed a dry creek bed, Clara dared a glance over her shoulder. He wasn't watching her, only the horizon, one hand loose on the reins, the other resting near the saddlebag where she guessed he kept his rifle. It took over an hour to reach his land. When they arrived, the sky was tinged with lavender and orange, the kind of quiet that felt holy. The house stood modest but solid weather-worn wood, a porch with 2 chairs, one missing a leg. A barn leaned slightly eastward, as if bowing to time. Beyond that, a chicken coop, a vegetable patch dry but not dead, and 2 water barrels catching the last slivers of daylight. She dismounted without help, boots hitting the dirt with a dull thud. Elijah led the horse to the barn, unsaddled him without a word, then returned to the house. He pushed open the front door and stepped aside, letting her enter first. The inside smelled of old wood, tobacco, and something faintly citrus. Clean, but lived in. He pointed to a door near the back. "That's yours." Clara walked slowly, hands at her sides, unsure whether to speak or remain quiet. Inside the room was a small bed, a chest of drawers, and a wash basin with a pitcher of water. The window faced west, looking out to a field of nothing but wild grass and wind, and the door, it had a lock, a real one, with a key. He handed it to her without a word. She turned it over in her palm. "You trust me." He met her eyes for the first time since leaving town. "No," he said, "but you deserve to lock your own door." Then he turned and walked away. That night, she didn't sleep. Not deeply, anyway. The bed was soft enough, and the quilt smelled faintly of cedar. But her mind wandered through dark corners. Why her? She replayed the auction in her head, the looks, the heat, the way he'd stepped forward like it meant nothing and everything all at once. She rose before dawn, unable to sit still. In the kitchen, he was already there, sipping black coffee from a chipped mug. He nodded once. She nodded back. No words. Breakfast was quiet. Toasted cornbread, thick with butter. Coffee bitter enough to burn. Afterward, she helped clean the dishes. He didn't ask, and she didn't explain why she felt she should. They moved like strangers orbiting the same silence. Later that morning, he brought in firewood. She gathered the eggs. The sun climbed slowly over the ridge. By the third day, routine had settled like dust on a bookshelf. They didn't speak much. She swept floors, tended the garden, learned the rhythm of the land. He chopped wood, repaired the fence, rode out each evening and returned after dusk. But the silence wasn't cruel. It was just there. A kind of companion neither of them invited, but both accepted. One evening, as twilight wrapped the hills in blue, Clara stood by the fence watching the wind move through the grass. It reminded her of choir songs, low, soft, filled with longing. Elijah approached quietly, holding a blanket. He draped it over the fence post beside her, but said nothing. She looked at him. "I don't understand," she said softly. "Why'd you do it?" He didn't answer right away. He looked past her, toward the dying sun. Then, finally, some debts aren't paid in coin. He tipped his hat and turned back toward the house. Clara stayed, blanket untouched, heart heavier than it had been in days. What did he mean, a debt to whom her father, or something deeper, something that lived in the cracks of his silence? She wrapped the blanket around her shoulders. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of earth and pine. For the first time since her world crumbled, the quiet didn't feel dangerous. It felt still. Some silences carry pain, others, promises. And Clara was just beginning to learn the difference. She had nothing but her name and calloused hands. But maybe that was enough. The days passed in quiet. Measured time, sunrise, work, meals, sunset, and the hush that followed. Clara rose each morning before the rooster, lighting the stove with trembling fingers. It took her several tries to coax a steady flame from the old wood-burning cooktop, the smoke curling up like a test of her patience. But by the end of the week, she had learned how to time the eggs just right, how to slice the cornmeal cakes so they browned evenly on the pan. Elijah never commented on the food, but he always finished every bite. That, in its own way, felt like a compliment. She washed clothes in the iron basin out back, wringing shirts and sheets with arms sore from unfamiliar effort. The wind dried them fast, and she began to notice small joys, the clean scent of lavender from the soap, the warmth of the sun on her face, the soft snap of cotton in the breeze. The garden, tucked behind the barn, had gone wild with neglect. Weeds choked the rows, and the soil cracked from heat. Still, Clara knelt each day and pulled what didn't belong, dug shallow trenches for water, whispered apologies to each struggling tomato vine. It wasn't much, but it was something to tend, something to believe in. Elijah didn't interfere. He came and went on his horse, always alone, always quiet. Sometimes he returned with a bag of nails, sometimes with a rabbit or two slung over the saddle. He'd clean them on a flat rock behind the barn, hands steady, eyes distant. They shared meals at the small kitchen table, sitting across from each other like cautious truce-bearers. He never asked questions. She never pushed him to. And yet she felt watched. Not in the cruel way men had looked at her in town, but in a way that felt like awareness. as if her presence was not lost on him, but noted, counted, respected. Once, she accidentally broke a glass while drying it. The sound echoed through the house like gunfire. She braced herself, expecting a word, a flinch, something, but Elijah only looked up from his chair, nodded once, and said, "Careful. That floor bites back," then went back to mending his boots. On the fifth night, the wind picked up, moaning through the eaves like an old widow. Clara couldn't sleep. She wandered through the darkened house, wrapped in the quilt from her room, bare feet quiet on the worn floorboards. In the front room, a sliver of moonlight spilled through the window, and there, resting in the corner, was a mandolin. It sat on a wooden stool, half in shadow, the strings dulled with time. The wood was dark cherry, curved like a woman's hip, with a faint etching of vines along the neck. Dust clung to its surface, but it hadn't been forgotten, only waiting. Clara stepped closer. She lifted it gently, cradling it like memory. Her fingers brushed the strings, coaxing out a soft hum. It wasn't perfectly tuned, but it still sang, quiet, longing, the kind of sound that settled into bone. She sat down, placed it on her knee, and began to play. Just a little tune she remembered from childhood, slow and gentle, notes that felt like porch swings in Sunday dresses. Her thumb trembled on the strings, but she kept going, letting the melody fill the silence like smoke curling from a chimney. Behind her, the hallway creaked. She turned. Elijah stood there, halfway between dark and light, his face unreadable. He didn't step into the room, didn't speak. He only listened. Then, after a long breath, he said, "It was hers." His voice was softer than she'd ever heard it. Clara swallowed. "Your wife." He nodded once. She played every night. Said it made the air less heavy. He didn't say anything else, just looked at the mandolin one more time, then turned and walked back down the hall. Clara sat there a long time after, the mandolin in her lap, her fingers still. The house was quiet again, but not empty. She traced the curve of the instrument, wondering what kind of woman had once played here, in this same light, with the same quiet man just a room away. What had she looked like, sounded like? Was she kind? Did she laugh? Did she ever wonder if this house was hers, or just a place she stayed? Clara stared out the window. The moon had risen higher now, casting the field in pale silver. The wind rustled the grass in long, steady waves. And Clara whispered, "Am I a guest here, or something else entirely?" Some houses are built from timber, others from memory. And Clara was slowly discovering which one she'd stepped into. He said almost nothing about his family, but the silence carried more pain than words ever could. It was a warm morning, the kind where everything felt almost forgiving. The sun filtered gently through the curtains, and the scent of boiled coffee lingered in the air. Elijah had ridden out early to tend to the northern fence. Clara, left alone, took it as a quiet invitation to dust the house. Not an order, he never gave those, but a kind of permission, as though the home itself was slowly opening to her, creaking its doors, trusting her hands. She moved from room to room with a rag and a bowl of soapy water, wiping down shelves, shaking out linens, folding what had been long forgotten. The house, though plain, had a lived-in stillness, the kind found in places once filled with voices now gone quiet. At the end of the hallway, a door stood slightly ajar. She hadn't been inside yet. Something about the way the light pooled around its edges drew her in, not like a lure, but like a memory waiting to be remembered. She pushed the door open. It was a bedroom, smaller than hers, but not by much. Dust coated the floor in a soft film, but everything was neat, untouched, almost preserved. The bed was made with a faded blue quilt, hand-stitched. A pair of women's gloves rested atop a wooden dresser, still holding their shape. On the wall, a single photograph hung slightly askew. Clara stepped closer. The photo showed a young woman with soft eyes and dark curls, holding a little girl perhaps 5 years old whose smile radiated wild joy. Her dress was crooked at the shoulder, her hair in unruly braids. The resemblance was clear. The curve of the mouth, the eyes, they were Elijah's. Clara felt something shift in her chest, a sorrow she hadn't earned, but which wrapped around her just the same. She moved to the dresser. Its drawers were mostly empty, some ribbons, a dried bouquet, a silver comb with 2 missing teeth. But the bottom drawer stuck slightly as she tugged. She knelt, jiggled the handle gently, and it gave. Inside was a folded cloth deep green, embroidered with vines, and beneath it, an envelope. She picked it up. The parchment was yellowed, but the ink still held strong. To Elijah Boone, it read in a familiar script. Her breath caught. She unfolded it slowly, careful not to tear the edges. There, in unmistakable strokes, was her father's handwriting. She didn't finish reading it. Not yet, because footsteps sounded behind her. She turned. Elijah stood in the doorway, his face shadowed by the morning light behind him. He didn't speak. His eyes drifted to the letter in her hand, then to the photograph on the wall. He stepped inside, slow and heavy, like someone visiting a grave. "I wasn't snooping," Clara said quickly. "Clara, I was cleaning. And I didn't mean to." "It's all right," he said, voice quiet. She waited for more. An explanation. A story. But he only walked to the dresser and ran a finger gently across the gloves. "I lost them 3 years ago," he said after a long silence. "Your wife and daughter." He nodded. "There was a slide up near Devil's Hollow. We were headed to the chapel in Rock Springs. Ruth always liked Sunday services with the old hymns. Said they made the baby sleep better." His voice broke slightly, just once, then steadied. "I rode behind. By the time I got there, the wagon was gone, buried under shale and ash." He didn't cry. He didn't need to. Clara felt the grief like a fog rolling in quiet. Total. She looked at the letter again, fingers trembling. "This is from my father." He didn't answer. "My father knew you, didn't he?" Elijah looked out the window, past the field, past the barn, to somewhere she couldn't follow. And for the first time since she arrived, she realized there were ghosts here, but not all of them were hers. Some letters hold secrets, some debts carry across generations, and Clara was about to learn hers was both. A photograph, a promise, and a war that tied their fates long before this town ever knew her name. The letter lay on the kitchen table, folded neatly, the edges worn by time. Clara hadn't touched it since she found it. It felt too fragile, like some truths needed stillness to speak. Elijah sat across from her, cup of coffee cooling untouched in his hands. The mandolin rested quietly in the corner. The room smelled of wood smoke and morning. Clara finally spoke. "My father wrote to you. He must have known you well." Elijah didn't look up, but when he did, his eyes weren't clouded like before. They were sharp, steady, like a man remembering not just grief, but purpose. "I met Silas Whitmore in '64, he said. Clara's heart skipped. Her father's name hadn't been spoken aloud in years. We were both stationed along the southern rail lines. He wasn't supposed to be there. Wore a collar, not a uniform. Said he was preaching to anyone who'd listen." He paused, took a breath. But Silas wasn't just preaching. He was listening, watching, carrying maps in the lining of his Bible, messages coded in Scripture. He wasn't just a preacher. He was Union intelligence. Clara gripped the edge of the table. My father was a spy. Elijah gave a slow nod. He saved a dozen men from walking into an ambush near Franklin, and he saved me. Another pause. We were surrounded. Confederate scouts had us pinned against the tracks. Silas rode out in the dark, alone, led him off like he was nothing more than a lost preacher looking for water. Elijah stared at the tabletop like he could still see it, the gunfire, the smoke, the man in a dusty black coat disappearing into the trees. They caught him, beat him, near to death, but we made it out. And my father, Clara asked. He survived. Barely. Elijah's voice softened. I sat beside him 3 nights while he healed in a cabin up north. He told me about you. Clara blinked fast, said you liked wildflowers, that you ran barefoot through the orchard, that you prayed too loud and laughed even louder. A long silence fell between them. Elijah looked down at his hands, weathered and calloused. He said, if you ever meet my Clara and I'm not around, look after her. Clara covered her mouth, tears pricking her eyes. She hadn't thought of her father's voice in years. Now it rang in her ears like church bells on Easter. She tried to imagine him alone, broken, placing his daughter's life in the hands of a stranger during the darkest part of a war. It felt unreal, too large to hold. And yet, here she sat, in the house of that very man. The air felt different now, not lighter, just deeper, like the floor beneath her feet wasn't made of wood and dirt anymore, but history. Elijah stood slowly, walked to the stove, refilled his cup. I didn't plan to find you, he said. Didn't even know it was you until that day in the square. But why did you buy me? She asked, voice cracking. Because of him, Elijah turned, met her eyes. Because no one else would. The words hit her harder than expected. Simple, final, not romantic, not heroic, just true. And that truth stung. She looked away, blinking again, harder this time. Was she here because of who she was, or because of who her father had been? Did Elijah see her, or just a promise he was too honorable to break? The room felt smaller somehow. The warmth of earlier replaced by a different kind of heat, tight, coiled, uncomfortable. She rose from the table and walked to the window. Outside, the wind moved gently through the wheatgrass, catching the sunlight in silver threads. Everything looked the same. But everything had changed. In the glass. Her reflection met her eyes, older than she remembered, and lonelier. Too, she thought of her calloused hands, her quiet nights, the house that now felt half hers and half borrowed. Behind her. Elijah poured another cup of coffee. She didn't turn. She only whispered to herself, just loud enough for the walls to hear. Was it kindness or obligation? Some answers come wrapped in silence, and some questions, like promises, don't fade with time. They came with polished boots and questions, and the past riding right behind them. It began with dust, not the kind stirred by cattle or wind, but the sharp, unsettled kind that rose under the hooves of men who didn't belong. Clara was at the general store when she first saw them 3 riders, tall in the saddle, their horses restless. Their coats were too fine, their boots too new. One man dismounted and tied his reins tight. He stood straighter than the rest, like someone used to giving orders. He stepped into the store behind her, hat still on, eyes scanning the room like he already owned it. She turned, face stiff with caution. He tipped his hat, just a little. You wouldn't happen to know a Clara Whitmore, would you? The words dropped into her chest like a stone. She didn't answer. The storekeeper, Mr. Forley, glanced between them, sensing the tension. "Can't say the name's familiar," Forley muttered. "We're a quiet town." The stranger smiled. "That's what I like about it." He moved past Clara, fingers trailing along a row of canned peaches like he was browsing a museum, not buying anything. His name was Malcolm Crane. She wouldn't learn that until later, when word of his questions reached the saloon, the blacksmith, and eventually the post office. By sundown, the whole town had heard it. Crane, treasure hunter, ex-militia, a man who once worked for both sides of the war and neither, depending on who paid more. He chased stories of buried Confederate gold, Union smuggling lines, old maps sealed in the hems of prayer books. Now he was here, looking for her. That night. Clara sat by the window, eyes on the road leading to Sweetwater Hollow. Elijah sat at the table, whittling a small block of wood with the kind of quiet focus only he could summon. "You feel it too, don't you?" she finally asked. Elijah didn't look up. "He's not passing through," she nodded. Silence stretched long between them. Then she said it, soft, shaken. "My father." He had a map. Elijah stopped carving. A map to what Clara swallowed. "I don't know. He never told me. But I saw it once, when I was little, hidden in the back of a hymnal. He said it was dangerous, that men had killed for less." Elijah leaned forward, hands folded. "Where is it now?" She looked him in the eye. He burned it, right before he died. Said some things weren't meant to be found. Elijah didn't speak, but his gaze turned toward the door like he expected it to open at any moment. "What would Crane want with you?" he asked. "He thinks I know something." "Do you?" Clara hesitated. "I know how to read his handwriting. His codes. I helped him, once. Just a child, tracing letters onto pages that didn't make sense until much later." She looked down. "But I don't know where anything is buried." If something was ever buried. The next day, they rode into town together. Elijah insisted. Crane was at the saloon, drinking slow, watching the mirror behind the bar more than his glass. When Elijah and Clara passed by, he didn't call out, just followed them with his eyes. Later, they stopped by the feed store, took time with supplies, lingered in conversation with Mr. Beck, the blacksmith. When they returned home, something felt off. The door was ajar. Inside, the floor bore footprints too sharp to be theirs. A cabinet stood open. A drawer hung crooked. Elijah moved through the house like a shadow, rifle in hand. The mandolin had been moved, not stolen, just disturbed, as if someone had touched it, then thought better of taking it. Clara stood in the doorway of her room. The chest of drawers had been rifled through. Her letters, what few she kept, scattered on the floor. Her father's letter to Elijah, once neatly folded, now bent at the edges. Someone had been looking. And they had found enough to know. There was more. Clara turned to Elijah, her voice barely a whisper. He was here. Some men search for gold, others search for ghosts. But Malcolm Crane had found something rarer, a secret that hadn't finished unraveling. The house wasn't just ransacked, it had been violated, and so had her peace. Clara stood in the doorway of her room, hands trembling at her sides. The drawers gaped open like mouths mid-scream. Pages of old letters, scattered across the floor, bore boot prints and tears. The bed had been tossed, her clothes thrown carelessly from the chest. The place she had begun to trust, this house, this quiet, now felt foreign, stripped, exposed. In the kitchen, Elijah inspected the cabinets. A jar of dried beans lay shattered. The table had been scratched by something sharp, maybe a knife. He moved with control, but the set of his jaw was tight. His fingers hovered near the revolver at his hip. "It wasn't random," he said quietly. Clara didn't answer. She knelt to pick up the crumpled letter from her father, her hands shaking. She smoothed the page flat on her lap and exhaled only when she saw that the ink hadn't been damaged. The paper was creased, but the words were still there. Later, after they'd put things back as best they could. Clara sat on the porch, wrapped in the same blanket Elijah had once draped over the fence post. Her heart beat too loud in her chest. "I thought this was over," she said to no one. Elijah stood nearby, silent, arms crossed. "I thought if I just stayed quiet, stayed gone, the past would leave me alone." He walked over slowly, sat beside her. "They don't come looking for the past," he said. "They come looking for what they think it left behind." She turned to him. "This is my fault." Elijah didn't speak. "If I hadn't come here," he looked at her then, voice firm. "Stop." The word froze her mid-sentence. "You didn't bring this here. It was already coming. Has been for years." She searched his face for anger, blame, but found only resolve. "Elijah, I can't stay. I've put you in danger. They'll be back." He didn't flinch. "This isn't just your fight. I don't want a fight. You already have one." Tears welled in her eyes, but she forced them down. "I can leave before it gets worse." "You leave," Elijah said slowly, "and he wins." Crane, no. Fear. His voice was different now, low, steady, like boots planting deep into the earth. "You've been running since the day your father died, maybe longer. But this land, this house, it's not just mine anymore." He met her eyes. "It's yours, too." The words hit her harder than any threat Crane could offer, not because they were grand, but because they were true. She blinked fast, heart caught between flight and something dangerously close to belonging. Elijah stood and stretched, rolling his shoulders like a man preparing for something long overdue. "We'll fix the windows, reinforce the barn doors. I've got wire fencing, and the well still draws clean water. We can hold this place if we need to." Clara stared up at him. "Hold it, like a fort." He gave a small smile, "like a home." That night, the stars came out, scattered like salt across the sky. Clara sat near the front window, her father's letter folded neatly beside a lantern. She listened to Elijah outside, dragging lumber, hammering nails, securing latches. Each thud, each scrape of metal, sounded like a promise being driven into the bones of the house. She had nowhere else to go. But maybe she didn't need anywhere else. Some homes are inherited, others are built in defiance, and theirs was about to be tested. If they wanted her, they'd have to come through him, and he'd already lost too much to lose her now. The morning after the break-in, Elijah rode out at dawn. Clara didn't ask where she only packed a basket of bread, jerky, and boiled eggs and handed it to him at the gate. He nodded, and then he was gone, dust rising behind the hooves of his horse. By sundown, he returned with Thomas Beck, the town's blacksmith, riding beside him with tools strapped to his saddle. They worked through the evening, quiet, focused, reinforced the doors, installed a new deadbolt carved by hand, wired the front gate to snap shut behind any intruder. Even the windows received fitted latches, strong as steel. Elijah doesn't build things to keep people out. Thomas had said to Clara with a wink, he builds them to protect what matters most inside. That night, Clara sat by the fire, hands curled around a cup of hot tea, no longer hiding, no longer unsure. This time, she had chosen to stay. Elijah gave her a pistol, not new, not polished, but it fit her palm like a handshake. "You may never need it," he said, "but you won't be the only one unarmed again." She nodded, didn't tremble. The fear was still there, but it didn't own her anymore. It was the third night after the break-in when the moon rose full and clear, bathing the land in cold silver, the kind of moonlight that made secrets easier to find. Clara had just doused the lantern when she heard it 3 soft taps against the window. She turned slowly. No shadow, no voice, just silence. Then a folded paper slid under the door. She opened it with shaking fingers. "Come to the old chapel, alone, or Elijah won't leave the morning alive." She didn't scream. She didn't run. She saddled Elijah's horse and left a single note on the kitchen table. "I'm not running. I'm choosing." The old chapel sat at the edge of Sweetwater Hollow, long abandoned, its steeple cracked and leaning. Once, her father had preached from its pulpit. Now, it was only a hollow shell of sermons long silenced. She stepped inside, breath catching in the chill. Crane stood near the altar, his hat low, one hand resting casually on a holstered pistol. "You came," he said, voice smooth. "Didn't expect you to. Thought maybe the old man would ride in instead." Clara kept her voice even. "You said if I didn't come, he'd get hurt." "True?" Crane smiled. "But I lie often." He stepped forward. "You know what I'm after. The map, the secrets. Your daddy's final treasure. There's nothing left. I don't believe that." He circled her slowly. "You've got his eyes and his mind. Bet you remember more than you realize." Clara's hand inched toward the pistol hidden in her skirt pocket. "You don't have to do this," she whispered. "Yes," Crane replied. "I do." He reached for her, and the back door slammed open. A single gunshot shattered the quiet. Crack! Crane spun. A second shot tore through the air, striking the beam beside his head. "Elijah Boone," Crane hissed. Elijah stood in the shadows, coat dusted with moonlight, rifle steady. "I warned you once," he said, voice low. "You shot me," Crane snapped, clutching his bleeding shoulder. "One warning." Crane lunged toward Clara. Another shot rang out. This time, it hit true straight through Crane's leg. He collapsed with a howl, pistol clattering across the stone floor. Elijah stepped forward, boots echoing with each step. Thud, thud, thud. He stood over Crane, breath calm. "It's over." Clara rushed to Elijah's side. She noticed the tear in his coat, blood seeping through at the waist. "You're hurt." He shrugged. "Just a scrape." She pressed her hand to the wound anyway, jaw set. "We're going home." Outside, the moon still watched, bright and silent. Behind them, the chapel whispered its last prayer into the wind. Crane had been stopped. But peace doesn't come easy. And healing never comes without scars. There was no church bell, no choir. But there was a mandolin and sunlight and love that needed no witness. 1 year had passed since the dust settled. Sweetwater Hollow had returned to its rhythm boots on porches, horses at dawn, pie contests, and Sunday potlucks. But something had shifted, a quiet healing, like soil learning how to hold roots again. Clara Whitmore stood at the front of the old wooden schoolhouse, chalk dust on her fingers, her dress catching the breeze through the open windows. 7 children sat at mismatched desks, eyes wide as she read from a book older than any of them. She paused between pages, let them guess what came next, let their imaginations bloom. When the bell rang, just a rusted triangle hung from a rope, they scattered with laughter, chasing each other through tall grass. She watched them go with a smile. This place had once tried to bury her. Now it had given her purpose. Elijah Boone was mending a fence when Thomas Beck rode up. grinning beneath a hat too small for his broad head. "You sure about today?" Thomas asked, holding a rolled-up piece of parchment. Elijah nodded, wiping sweat from his brow. She said, "Yes. That's the only thing I've ever been sure of." Thomas handed him the paper. "It ain't a church license, but it's legal enough for Sweetwater." Elijah took it, stared at the name written beside his Clara Mae Whitmore. He folded it carefully, slid it into his pocket like something sacred. Near the edge of the ranch, where the land dipped toward the riverbed, stood an old cottonwood tree. Its leaves had begun to turn amber and soft green, clinging to the last warmth of summer. Under its branches, a quilt was laid, simple, handmade, edges fraying. Clara arrived wearing a pale cream dress, hair pinned with sprigs of wildflower. She walked barefoot through the grass, carrying nothing but a ribbon tied around her wrist. No veil, no bouquet, just her. Elijah waited in his best shirt, boots polished, rifle nowhere in sight. Beside them, Eleanor Quinn, the widowed midwife who'd once patched Elijah's shoulder, held a worn Bible in one hand and a mandolin in the other. Thomas stood on the side, wiping at his eyes with a red handkerchief. The children gathered in front, whispering and pointing as if they'd been invited to a fairy tale. The vows were spoken softly, not because they were shy, but because they understood something louder than words. Elijah took Clara's hands. "We choose each other," he said, voice steady, no matter how hard yesterday was. Clara nodded, eyes glistening, and, "No matter how uncertain tomorrow may be," she replied. Eleanor smiled, closing the Bible. "I now pronounce you husband and wife. May your roots run deep, and your storms pass quick." The mandolin began to play. Not a hymn, not a wedding march. Just a tune Clara had once played in the dark, when she thought she was alone. Elijah recognized it. He reached for her waist, pulled her gently into the softest sway. The cottonwood leaves danced above them. The children clapped in rhythm, and someone, maybe Thomas, started singing off-key. But it was perfect. Later, they sat on the quilt, sharing slices of apple pie and stories from a time they no longer feared. Clara leaned into Elijah, her head on his shoulder. "You think your daughter would have liked this spot?" she asked quietly. "She would have loved it," Elijah whispered. "And your wife." He smiled. "She would have told me I waited long enough." The sun dipped low, casting gold across the field. The mandolin still hummed in the breeze, and the laughter of children echoed like a promise. It was not the kind of wedding anyone would write about in the papers. But for Sweetwater Hollow, and for two hearts once scattered like ashes, it was more than enough. The past had not been erased, but it had been softened, and in its place, a new story had begun to bloom. She'd been sold once, but here, in this home built of quiet hands and louder hearts, she finally belonged. The morning sun warmed the porch of the Big Elm Ranch, and Clara sat with pen in hand, a half-written letter resting on her knee. It was addressed to a cousin in Missouri, a woman she hadn't seen in years, but who once braided Clara's hair beneath the willow tree behind the church. Her words came slowly, but they came. "I was sold once," she wrote, "but it wasn't the end of me. Turns out, being claimed is not the same as being seen. And being loved, that's not something anyone can buy or sell." She paused, smiling softly, watching Elijah in the field. He moved slower these days, not with weakness, but with the kind of ease that came from having survived. The land had changed too. The fence line had been pushed further out, the garden now lush and giving. The barn was freshly painted, and two new horses grazed beneath the cottonwood's shade. Elijah had begun taking in strays not just animals, but people. A widower from Abilene who needed work, a runaway boy with too much hunger and too little hope. They stayed, helped, found quiet. It was Clara who had brought that to them. Her schoolhouse had grown, too. She now taught 12 children, some from as far as the neighboring county. On warm afternoons, she opened the windows wide, letting the sound of laughter pour out onto the prairie. She told them stories, taught them letters, numbers, maps, but sometimes she taught them something more. That freedom wasn't always about running, that some roots were worth growing deep, and that the loudest courage often came in the softest acts. The town of Sweetwater Hollow had changed its tune as well. No longer the place that looked at her with suspicion or silence, it had learned to nod when she passed, to say good morning, to invite her pies to the autumn fair. They never forgot what happened, but they remembered who she became after. And that was enough. One evening, just as the light began to turn honey gold, Clara stood on the porch holding Ruth's mandolin. She hadn't touched it in weeks, but tonight felt right. She sat in the rocker, cradling the curved wood, fingers adjusting the strings. She played softly at first, letting the notes wander. Then the melody came clear, warm, and haunting. The same song Ruth had once played for her daughter, the one Clara had learned by ear that night, long ago, before anything was safe. Now, the song had changed, still recognizable, but gentler, like it had grown up with her. Elijah stepped onto the porch, boots echoing on the wood. He didn't speak, just leaned against the post and listened. His eyes, once always guarded, softened. And then it happened. He smiled, not the fleeting curve of the lips he offered to strangers, but a full, quiet smile, the kind Ruth might have once known. The kind his daughter might have returned. Clara looked up, tears catching in the corner of her eyes, and smiled back. The music faded into dusk. The wind moved through the fields like a hush, and for the first time in forever, nothing needed fixing, nothing needed fearing. Everything was enough, inside. The letter to her cousin remained unfinished, but Clara added one last line. "No one bought me that day," she wrote. "He just gave me back what was always mine, my name, my dignity, and a chance at forever." The lamp was lit, the doors were locked, not in fear, but in peace, and the night closed gently around them, like a prayer softly spoken. Sometimes, the most powerful redemption doesn't come from grand gestures or dramatic change, but from choosing to stay when every instinct tells you to run. Clara's journey reminds us that dignity can be stolen, but it can also be reclaimed through kindness, quiet courage, and the patience to rebuild trust one day at a time. Elijah didn't save her with wealth or words. He saved her by making space, by offering safety without control, and love without conditions. And in return, she gave him something he'd buried long ago, the belief that healing is still possible, even after unimaginable loss. This story isn't just about surviving a cruel world. It's about choosing to belong again, to plant roots in a place once barren, to believe that love, no matter how late it arrives, is still worth waiting for, because home isn't always where you come from. Sometimes it's where someone finally looks at you not as a burden, but as a life worth loving. Thank you for joining us on this journey through dust, loss, and quiet redemption. If Clara and Elijah's story touched your heart, please consider giving this video a like, sharing it with someone who might need its message, and subscribing to the channel. Your support helps these forgotten voices find a place in today's world. And every click, every comment keeps these echoes alive, Until next time, take care of your heart and each other.